Okay, picking up on question number 10. President Harding's 1920 campaign slogan was a return to normalcy. What does this mean? So Harding advocated to move away from progressivism, have less government involvement in the economy, less help from the government to people, and going back to the idea of a laissez-faire approach to the economy with less regulation, less government involvement. Number 11, President Harding is best remembered for a major scandal during his presidency. Explain what happened during the Teapot Dome scandal. So basically, Harding's Secretary of the Interior was taking bribes to illegally give out leases to oil companies to drill for oil on government land. The scandal was discovered. Some people went to jail. But the reason we study it is the whole Teapot Dome scandal kind of exemplified the corruption that took place in Harding's administration and kind of shows why he's remembered as being an ineffective president. Number 12, the Great Depression hit farmers before it hit the rest of the country. Why were farmers doing so poorly in the 1920s? So the big ideas were overproduction and underconsumption. This was especially because during World War I, because Europe really was unable to produce any agricultural goods because of the fighting that was happening there, American farmers were producing the goods and selling them to Europe. They were making a lot of money doing that. But after the war was over, Europe began to produce their own goods again and didn't need the U.S. agricultural goods anymore. American farmers were still producing, but they had nowhere to sell those goods. 13, Presidents Harding and Coolidge were strong believers in laissez-faire government. How did this attitude affect how our government approached business in the 1920s? So again, as I stated before, in the 1920s with Harding and Coolidge, we see a decrease in government rules, a decrease in government regulation, less government supervision of the economy, and a movement away from progressivism back toward laissez-faire. 14, during the 1920s, many Americans engaged in reckless behavior with their money. Describe each of the following reckless practices. Buying stocks on margin. That essentially means buying stocks, which, as we know, can decrease in value literally overnight with borrowed money. It's very risky because if you borrow that money, you buy that stock, the stock can become worthless, but you still owe the money you borrowed and you got to pay that back. And then B, installment buying. This is basically acquiring a product and maybe only paying a little bit up front and paying the rest off in installments over time. This was also risky because you got the product, you could make a few payments, but if you miss one payment, they basically repossess the product you bought and you're still out all the money that you paid so far. 15, how did rising tariffs of the 1920s affect world trade? So basically tariffs, which as we know are taxes on imported goods, were put in place by many, many countries, oftentimes to retaliate for a tariff that was put in place by a different nation. And the net effect of these tariffs is that it slowed down or really reduced trade overall between nations to a significant degree. 16, list 5 basic causes of the Great Depression. So we have overproduction and underconsumption, especially of agricultural goods, severe income inequality, a weak banking system, poor international economy with some of those tariffs we talked about, the slowdown in international trade, some of the agricultural problems we've already talked about, the practice of buying stocks on margin, and finally the stock market crash in 1929. 17, President Hoover did not believe the federal government should drastically intervene in the economy to help, but he did take some action. So one of the things Hoover did was he initiated some spending on public works projects that built infrastructure like the Hoover Dam, but this was insufficient and was not nearly enough to help with the severity of the problems during the Depression. 18, how did the attitude of rugged individualism affect many people's reaction to the Great Depression? So this idea of rugged individualism held that people should be responsible for themselves. It was not the government's job to step in and help them out when they were facing economic problems. So the result was a lot of people blamed themselves and in some cases even committed suicide or left their families because they felt responsible for their own problems during the Depression. 19, Hoover believed strongly in the concept of trickle-down economics. Explain what this means. So the idea behind trickle-down economics is tax cuts at the top to very wealthy, to big businesses, and even sometimes money to help big businesses, with the hope that they then reinvest that money in hiring more workers, increasing wages, increasing hours. So that money trickles down to the rest of the people. But unfortunately, this doesn't always work, and the money never actually makes its way down to the rest of society.